What if one of the most sacred ideas in modern civilization wasn't beyond criticism? What if democracy, celebrated across the Western world as the pinnacle of political progress, contained flaws so deep that they quietly undermine prosperity, freedom, and even civilization itself? For most people, democracy is not merely a political system. It is treated almost like a moral truth. Questioning it often provokes stronger reactions than questioning religion. Yet in 2001, one economist dared to challenge this modern orthodoxy. His name was Hans Hermann Hoppe. His book, Democracy, The God That Failed, quickly became one of the most controversial works ever written within libertarian political philosophy. Some praised it as one of the boldest critiques of modern government ever published. Others condemned it as dangerously radical. Regardless of where one stands, one fact is difficult to deny. Very few books force readers to rethink their assumptions about political power as profoundly as this one. Hoppe was not writing as a career politician. He was writing as an economist shaped by the Austrian school, the intellectual tradition of Ludwig von Mises and Murray Rothbard. Like them, he believed economics begins not with governments, but with individuals making choices. Every economic system, every institution, and every society ultimately depends on human incentives. And according to Hoppe, understanding incentives is the key to understanding politics. His central question is surprisingly simple. Who takes better care of valuable property? Someone who owns it, or someone who merely manages it temporarily? At first, the answer seems obvious. If you own a house, you have every reason to preserve it, improve it, and think about its long-term value. If you're renting that same house for a weekend, your incentives are very different. You enjoy the benefits today, while someone else bears much of the long-term cost. Hoppe argues that the same logic applies to political institutions. This analogy becomes the foundation of one of his most controversial arguments. According to Hoppe, traditional monarchies, despite their many historical abuses, created incentives fundamentally different from modern democracies. A monarch, he argues, viewed the territory under his control as a form of private property. His heirs would likely inherit it. Its long-term productivity directly affected his family's future wealth. Democratic politicians, by contrast, temporarily control what Hoppe describes as public property. They hold office only for a limited time. They cannot sell the country. They cannot pass ownership to their children. Their incentive, he argues, is not to maximize long-term value, but to maximize short-term political gains before leaving office. Whether one agrees with this conclusion or not, it illustrates the economic framework through which Hoppe analyzes government. His comparison is not primarily about personalities, it is about incentives. This focus on incentives reflects one of the Austrian school's central insights. Ludwig von Mises repeatedly argued that institutions matter because they shape human behavior. People respond to incentives. Governments are no exception. Hoppe extends this logic into politics. If political actors face incentives that reward debt, spending, inflation, and promises financed by future taxpayers, then these outcomes should not surprise us. They become predictable consequences of the system itself. One concept appears repeatedly throughout Hoppe's work: time preference. Originally developed within Austrian economics, time preference describes how individuals value present satisfaction compared to future benefits. Someone with low time preference delays gratification. They save. They invest. They build. They think in decades rather than days. High time preference, by contrast, encourages immediate consumption at the expense of the future. Hoppe argues that healthy civilizations depend on widespread low time preference. Stable property rights encourage people to invest in businesses, education, families, and communities because they expect to enjoy the future fruits of their efforts. But what happens when political institutions increasingly reward short-term thinking? Hopper argues that democratic politics naturally encourages higher time preference. Election cycles reward immediate benefits. Government debt pushes costs onto future generations. Inflation reduces the incentive to save. Political competition often becomes a contest over who can promise more benefits today. Whether this diagnosis fully explains modern politics remains a matter of debate. But it raises a question worth considering. How much of today's political culture is focused on the next generation, and how much is focused on the next election? Property rights occupy an even deeper place in Hobbes' philosophy. Following Murray Rothbard, Hoppe argues that private property is not merely an economic tool, it is the foundation of peaceful cooperation itself. Scarcity exists because multiple people may desire the same resources. Without clearly defined ownership, conflict becomes unavoidable. Property rights create predictable rules for resolving these conflicts peacefully. From this perspective, civilization itself depends upon respecting ownership. Hoppe traces these ideas back to natural rights traditions developed by thinkers such as John Locke and later expanded by Rothbard. Individuals own themselves. They acquire external property through original appropriation and voluntary exchange. Force becomes justified only in defense against aggression. This principle eventually became known among libertarians as the non-aggression principle. If no individual possesses the moral right to initiate force against peaceful people, Hoppe asks, how can any institution acquire such a right simply by calling itself the state? This question leads directly into one of his most controversial conclusions. Hoppe argues that the state operates as a territorial monopoly over the legitimate use of force. Unlike private organizations, governments generally face little direct competition within their jurisdictions. From an Austrian perspective, monopolies insulated from competition often produce lower quality, higher costs, and weaker incentives for efficiency. Hoppe argues that government is no exception. If consumers can choose among competing producers of food, technology, transportation, or education, why should legal and security services remain monopolized? His answer ultimately leads toward libertarianism and eventually anarcho-capitalism. Here Hoppe follows Murray Rothbard's vision of a society based entirely upon voluntary exchange and competing private institutions rather than compulsory government monopolies. Supporters see this as the logical extension of individual liberty. Critics question whether such systems could adequately provide justice, defense, or public order. The debate continues today. Another fascinating and often misunderstood concept introduced by Hoppe is what he calls the natural elite. This phrase does not refer to hereditary nobility or political privilege. Rather, Hoppe argues that every free society naturally produces individuals who earn influence through talent, entrepreneurship, wisdom, integrity, and productive achievement. Successful business owners, respected scholars, inventors, community leaders, people whom others voluntarily admire rather than politically obey. According to Hoppe, genuine leadership emerges naturally through voluntary respect, not through coercive political power. This distinction reflects another recurring Austrian insight. Markets reward value creation. Politics often rewards popularity and coalition building. The two processes are fundamentally different. Hoppe argues that modern democracies increasingly blur this distinction. Political success becomes disconnected from productive contribution. Promises replace production. Redistribution replaces voluntary exchange. Power replaces persuasion. Frédéric Bastiat warned about a similar danger more than a century earlier. When plunder becomes a way of life for a group of men living together in society, they create for themselves a legal system that authorizes it and a moral code that glorifies it. Hoppe's critique echoes this concern. As governments expand their responsibilities, political competition increasingly revolves around controlling the machinery of redistribution. Instead of asking how wealth is created, public debate often focuses on how existing wealth should be divided. The Austrian school consistently reverses that question. Before wealth can be redistributed, someone must first create it. No discussion of Hoppe would be complete without mentioning his mentor, Murray Rothbard. Rothbard transformed Austrian economics into a comprehensive philosophy of liberty built upon natural rights, self-ownership, and voluntary exchange. Hoppe extended many of these ideas while adding his own contributions in ethics, political philosophy, and institutional economics. His work also draws heavily from Ludwig von Mises, whose calculation argument demonstrated why centrally planned economies struggle to allocate resources efficiently without genuine market prices. For Hoppe, this insight reaches beyond socialism. The broader lesson is that concentrated political power consistently suffers from incentive problems and knowledge limitations. No group of officials, however intelligent, possesses all the dispersed information held by millions of individuals making voluntary decisions every day. Markets coordinate this information through prices. Politics attempts to replace that process through authority. This distinction lies at the heart of Austrian economics. Perhaps the greatest contribution of democracy, The God That Failed, is not that it convinces every reader. It probably won't. Its greatest contribution is that it forces uncomfortable questions. Why do governments accumulate so much debt? Why do political incentives often favor short-term popularity over long-term stability? Why do societies with stronger property rights generally experience greater prosperity? Can monopolies over law and force truly remain accountable? Is political competition fundamentally different from market competition? Even readers who reject Hoppe's conclusions often admit that these questions deserve serious consideration. In an age where political polarization dominates public discourse, Hoppe asks us to step back and examine something deeper than parties or elections. He asks us to examine the incentives built into political institutions themselves. Whether democracy is truly the God that failed remains one of the most fiercely debated questions in modern political philosophy. But perhaps the real lesson of Hoppe's work is not that we should stop questioning democracy, it is that we should never stop questioning power, because history repeatedly reminds us that power, regardless of ideology or good intentions, has a remarkable tendency to expand. And as Lord Acton famously warned, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. For Hoppe, the greatest safeguard against that tendency is not blind faith in political systems. It is a society built upon private property, voluntary cooperation, decentralized institutions, and the enduring principle that no person or government should stand above the rights of the individual. Whether you ultimately agree with his vision or reject it entirely, one thing is certain. After reading Democracy, The God That Failed, you will never look at political power in quite the same way again.